Eliza Hartwell hit the ground face first. Her wedding dress caught on the stagecoach door and ripped clean down the back as she fell. Blood from her split mouth left a dark stain in the dust of Copper Bluff's main street. 3 days married. 3 days of fists and whiskey breath and begging God to let her die. Her husband had beaten her unconscious, dragged her onto the next stage west, and told the driver if she ever came back, he'd bury her in the desert where no one would look. She had nothing. No money. No name worth keeping. No place left on earth to go. Want to know how a thrown-away bride and a man who'd buried his heart found something worth living for? Stay with me until the end. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story reaches. And if you haven't already, subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a story. The stagecoach driver's name was Pepper Hobbs, and he'd been hauling passengers across Arizona territory for 19 years. He'd seen gunshot wounds. He'd seen cholera. He'd seen a man scalped and still breathing. But he'd never seen anything like the woman crumpled at his feet. "Ma'am." He crouched beside her, keeping his voice low, the way you'd talk to a spooked horse. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Eliza Hartwell opened her one good eye. The left one was swollen shut, purple-black, sealed like someone had stitched it closed with a hot iron. Her jaw was wrong somehow, shifted, and when she tried to speak, the pain made her vision go white. "Where?" she managed. "Copper Bluff," Pepper said. "End of the line for me. I can't take you no further, but I can. Then this is where I stop." She tried to stand, her legs folded like wet paper. Pepper caught her before she hit the ground again, and that's when he felt her ribs through the torn fabric of her dress. Bones grinding where bones shouldn't grind. He'd handled enough injured cattle to know at least 2 were broken. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. The crowd came fast. They always did in towns like this. Towns where nothing happened for weeks, and then everything happened at once. Ranch hands still smelling of horses. A woman clutching a broom in her doorway. 2 men from the saloon with cards still in their hands. And others. The kind that gathered around weakness the way coyotes circled a downed calf. Eliza felt their eyes. She'd learned to read eyes in the last 3 days. Douglas Mercer had taught her that. His eyes had changed between the wedding and the first blow, going from warm to empty in the time it took to pour a glass of whiskey. And she'd learned that lesson with her body. These eyes were different flavors of the same hunger. Pity, curiosity, calculation. A woman alone, broken, no luggage, no ring visible on her swollen fingers. Every predator in Copper Bluff was doing arithmetic. "Well now," a man pushed through. Tall, slick, wearing a vest that cost more than most men made in a month. He smiled the way a cat smiles at a mouse it hasn't decided to kill yet. "Ain't this a sorry sight?" "Back off, Virgil," Pepper said, but there was no steel in it. Pepper was a driver, not a fighter, and everyone knew it. Virgil Kane didn't even look at him. He crouched in front of Eliza, close enough that she could smell pomade and tobacco, and something underneath both that reminded her of Mercer. That sweet rot smell of a man who enjoyed other people's pain. "Name's Virgil Kane, sweetheart. I own the Lucky Dollar, right there across the street. Finest establishment in Copper Bluff." He tilted his head, studying her bruises like he was appraising livestock. "Looks like you've had yourself a rough go. I can help with that. Warm bed, hot food, money in your pocket." Eliza knew exactly what kind of help he meant. She'd known it the second she heard his voice. Men like Virgil spoke in code, but the translation was always the same. "No," she said. Just the one word, because her jaw couldn't handle more. Virgil's smile didn't waver. Now don't be hasty. A woman in your condition, without friends or funds, she said no. The voice came from behind Virgil, and something about it made the crowd shift. Not loud, not angry. Flat, like a hammer hitting an anvil. A statement of fact that didn't require agreement. Caleb Dunn stood at the edge of the gathered crowd with a 50-pound sack of flour on one shoulder and his other hand hanging loose at his side. Close to the colt on his hip, but not touching it. Not yet. He was tall. That was the first thing Eliza noticed. Tall and lean, built the way fence wire is built. Nothing wasted, everything functional. His clothes were working clothes, denim and leather, sweat-stained and sun-faded. His face looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that surrounded the town, all angles and weather lines, with eyes the color of creek water after a storm. Gray-green, unreadable. Virgil stood slowly. Didn't ask for your opinion, Dunn. Didn't need your permission to give it. The lady's got no money, no people, nowhere to go. I'm offering employment. What are you offering? The same, Caleb said, except mine don't require her to take her clothes off. Something moved through the crowd. Not quite laughter, more like air being released. Virgil's jaw tightened, and for a moment the mask slipped, and Eliza saw what was underneath. Cold fury. The same cold fury she'd seen in Mercer's eyes before the backhand came. Careful, Dunn. I'm always careful. Caleb shifted the flour sack like it weighed nothing and looked directly at Eliza for the first time. Ma'am, I've got a ranch about 4 miles out. Lost my housekeeper last month. I need someone to cook and keep the place from falling apart. Room and board plus $2 a week. Your own space with a door that locks from the inside. A door that locks from the inside. Of all the things he could have said, that was the one that broke through. Eliza looked up at this stranger, searching his face for the lie, for the angle, for whatever it was he really wanted. Because men always wanted something. But Caleb Dunn's face gave her nothing. Not pity, not hunger. Just a steady patience, like a man accustomed to waiting for things to make up their own minds. I'll take it, she said. Like hell she will. Virgil stepped forward, and Caleb's hand moved. Not to his gun, just down to his belt, thumb hooked casually in the leather. But the shift in his posture said everything his mouth didn't, and Virgil stopped. The lady made her choice, Caleb said. You got a problem with that, Virgil? We can discuss it. But not here, and not now. For 5 full seconds, Copper Bluff's main street was silent. Then Virgil laughed, an ugly sound that scraped like a blade on stone. Your funeral done. Taking in strays always ends bloody. He pointed at Eliza without looking at her. When he's done with you, sweetheart, you know where to find me. I guarantee my accommodations are more comfortable. He walked away. His men followed. The crowd began to scatter, the show apparently over. Pepper Hobbs let out a breath he'd been holding. She got on the stage in Tucson, he told Caleb quietly. Men named Douglas Mercer put her on. Paid her passage with a threat, not money. Said if she showed her face again, he'd put her in the ground. Mercer, Caleb repeated. The gambler. The animal, Pepper corrected. He lowered his voice further. She was wearing that dress when she boarded. Wedding dress. 3 days married. He did all that in 3 days. Something crossed Caleb's face, there and gone so fast Eliza almost missed it. A tightening around the eyes, a muscle jumping in his jaw. Then it was gone, and he was reaching toward her, not grabbing, just offering his arm the way you'd offer a lifeline to someone drowning. Can you walk? He asked. I'll walk if it kills me. She took his arm. The pain in her ribs nearly dropped her, but she locked her knees and put one foot in front of the other, because she'd crawled out of Douglas Mercer's rooms on her hands and knees, and she'd sworn she would never crawl again. They made it to the general store. Josiah Buchanan, the owner, took one look at Eliza and pulled a chair out so fast it scraped across the floor. "Good God Almighty," he said. "Josiah," Caleb set down the flower. "Mrs. He looked at Eliza. "Hartwell," she said immediately. She would die before she used Mercer's name. "Eliza Hartwell." "Mrs. Hartwell is going to be working at my place. She needs supplies. Put everything on my account." Josiah nodded, but his wife was already moving. Nell Buchanan came out of the back room like a woman on a mission. She was 55, built like a whiskey barrel, with hands that could set a bone or bake a pie with equal efficiency. She took one look at Eliza, and her eyes went hard. "Josiah, get the men out of here. Caleb, that means you too. You should go load your wagon and let me take care of this girl. Go on." Caleb went. Eliza found herself alone with Nell Buchanan in the back room, surrounded by bolts of fabric and the smell of lavender soap, and something inside her cracked open like a dam. "Don't you dare cry yet," Nell said firmly, but her hands were gentle as she helped Eliza out of the ruined dress. "Crying's for later, when you're safe and fed and alone. Right now, I need to see what he did to you." Eliza stood in her torn undergarments and watched Nell's face change. The older woman had seen plenty in her years. She'd been a field nurse at Shiloh, had held boys together while surgeons sawed, but the map of bruises on Eliza's body made her go pale. 3 days? Nell's voice was barely a whisper. "The first night he was charming, brought flowers, said I was prettier than my letters promised." Eliza's voice was flat, reciting facts. "The second night he lost at cards, came back drunk. I learned what his hands could do when they weren't holding flowers." "And the third?" Eliza touched her ribs. "The third morning he dragged me out of bed by my hair, threw me down the stairs, and told the stagecoach driver to take me anywhere that wasn't Tucson." Nell pulled a simple blue cotton dress from a shelf. "This was ordered by a woman who never came back for it. About your size." She helped Eliza into it with the practiced tenderness of someone who dressed wounded people before. "Listen to me, child. Caleb Dunn is a good man. Quiet. Lord, he's quiet as a stone. But good. You're safe with him. That's what people said about Douglas Mercer. His letters were beautiful. Caleb Dunn doesn't write pretty letters, doesn't say pretty words, doesn't make promises he can't keep." Nell buttoned the dress and stepped back. "But I've watched that man carry a lame horse 2 miles rather than shoot it. I've seen him sit up all night with a dying calf. A man who's gentle with animals in pain is generally gentle with people in pain too. Why doesn't he have a wife?" Nell's hands stilled. "He did, once, before he came here. Her name was Hannah." She paused, choosing words carefully. "She died. He doesn't talk about it. Nobody pushes him to. He came to Copper Bluff 5 years ago, looking like a man who'd already been buried and just hadn't laid down yet. Bought the old Redfield place, fixed it up, and hasn't let a soul close since. Until today." Until today, Nell met her eyes. Make of that what you will. When Eliza emerged, Caleb was loading the wagon. He glanced at her in the blue dress and nodded once. "Better. Can you manage the wagon seat, or do you need to lie down in the back?" "I'll sit up front." He helped her up. His hands were careful, touching only where necessary, releasing the moment she was settled. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they pulled away from the store, Eliza saw Virgil Kane watching from the saloon porch. He raised his glass to her in a mocking toast. She turned her face forward and didn't look back. They rode in silence for a while. The road was rough, and every bump sent fire through Eliza's broken ribs, but she bit down on the inside of her cheek and didn't make a sound. "My ranch isn't much," Caleb said after a mile. 300 acres, some cattle, horses. The house needs work inside. I can keep animals alive, but I can't keep a kitchen worth a damn." "I can keep a kitchen." "There's a room off the kitchen, has its own door to the outside. You can lock it. Come and go as you please. I won't ever enter that room without knocking and being invited in." Eliza turned to look at him. "Why does that matter to you? Making sure I know I can get out?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. The horse's hooves kept rhythm on the packed earth. Then he said, "Because someone I loved needed a way out once, and I didn't give it to her in time." He didn't say anything else, and Eliza didn't ask. They both had graves they weren't ready to open. The ranch appeared as the sun dropped low. Adobe house, wide porch, a barn, a corral with 4 horses watching their approach with ears forward. A dog came out from under the porch, a leggy mutt with one blue eye and one brown, tail low and cautious. "That's Brutus," Caleb said. "He'll need to smell you before he decides." Eliza held her hand out. Brutus approached slowly, sniffed her fingers, sniffed her boots, sniffed the blood she could still feel dried on her neck. Then his tail moved. Once. Twice. "You're in," Caleb said. Almost smiled. Didn't quite make it. He showed her the house. Main room with a stone fireplace and a table built for 4, but only ever used by 1. Kitchen with a good stove and a pump that brought water inside. Her room, small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and 2 doors. One to the kitchen, one to the outside. "I usually eat at sundown," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway, hat in his hands. "But tonight, you should rest. I'll manage." "Mr. Dunn." "Caleb." "Caleb." Eliza stood in the door of her room, this tiny space that was hers, with its lock that worked, and its 2 exits, and its window with real glass. "I need you to understand something. I'm grateful for the work and the shelter. But if you're expecting anything beyond cooking and cleaning—" "I'm expecting you to cook, clean, and maybe stop the garden from dying," Caleb said. "That's the whole list. Your door locks from inside. I'll never test it." He put his hat on and walked out toward the barn. Eliza closed her door, turned the lock, heard it click, and then she sat on the narrow bed and pressed her hands to her broken ribs and cried. Not from pain, though there was plenty of that, but from the simple, shocking mercy of a locked door and a man who walked away when he said he would. She cried until she had nothing left. Then she washed her face with water from the pitcher, found liniment in the dresser drawer, and carefully tended her wounds. Through the window she could see lamplight in the barn where Caleb was still working. Brutus lay on the porch between their 2 worlds, guarding both. A knock came, soft, respectful. "Mrs. Hartwell, there's a tray outside your door. Just soup and bread, nothing fancy." His footsteps retreated before she could answer. She opened the door. The tray sat on the kitchen floor, a bowl of stew still steaming, thick bread, a glass of water, and next to the water, a small tin of peppermint drops with a note in rough handwriting. "For the pain. Works better than whiskey and won't make you stupid." Eliza picked up the tin and held it against her chest and stood there in the doorway of her locked room in a dead woman's dress on a stranger's ranch in a territory she couldn't find on a map. And for the first time in 26 years, she felt like she might actually survive her own life. She ate everything on the tray. She took 2 peppermint drops and let them dissolve on her swollen tongue. She lay down on the narrow bed and listened to the desert silence, so different from Illinois, from Tucson, from everywhere she'd been before. No footsteps approaching her door. No whiskey bottles shattering against walls. No voice telling her she was worthless, ugly, lucky he'd paid for her at all. Just wind, just distance, just the soft sound of Brutus shifting on the porch. Eliza Hartwell closed her one good eye and let the darkness take her. Tomorrow she would earn her keep. Tomorrow she would begin the work of remembering who she was before Douglas Mercer tried to unmake her. But tonight she slept without fear, and that, after everything, felt like the closest thing to God's own grace she'd ever known. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. Morning hit like a fist. The rooster's scream drove straight through Eliza's skull, and her body answered with every bruise it owned. She lay still for a full minute, taking inventory. Ribs, bad. Jaw, worse. Left eye, still sealed, but maybe a crack of light getting through. Fingers, working. Legs, working. Heart, beating. That would have to be enough. She dressed in the blue cotton, pinned her hair as best she could with shaking hands, and stepped into the kitchen. Caleb was already gone. Coffee sat on the stove, still hot, and a note lay on the table in that same rough handwriting. North Pasture, back by noon. Rest if you need to. C. Eliza looked at the kitchen, looked at the dust on every surface, the stack of unwashed plates, the floor that hadn't seen a broom in weeks. She poured herself coffee, drank it standing up because sitting hurt worse, and went to work. She started with the dishes. Hot water, lye soap, her broken ribs screaming with every reach and scrub. She found a rhythm that kept the pain below the line where she'd black out, and she stayed in that rhythm for an hour, plate by plate, cup by cup, working the way she'd always worked, because work was the one thing that had never betrayed her. By the time Caleb came back at noon, the kitchen was a different room. Surfaces cleaned, floors swept and mopped, bread dough rising under a cloth, beans soaking in a pot. She'd even found the pantry and reorganized it by type, the way her mother had taught her before the consumption took her. Caleb stood in the doorway, hat in hand, staring. "You shouldn't have pushed this hard," he said. "I need to earn my keep." "You've earned a month's keep in one morning." He looked at the bread dough, the soaking beans, the gleaming surfaces. "I forgot this place could look like this." "When did your housekeeper leave?" 6 weeks ago. Consuelo. Her granddaughter was having a baby in Tucson. He set his hat on the hook by the door, a habit she would come to know as ritual. "I've been managing." "You've been surviving. There's a difference." Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who understood that distinction better than most. They ate lunch together at the clean table. Simple food, bread and beans and coffee. Neither of them spoke much, but Eliza was learning to read Caleb's silences the way she'd once read Mercer's moods. Mercer's silence had been a held breath before a storm. Caleb's silence was just silence. Restful, safe. Like sitting beside a lake that had no intention of drowning you. "Your face looks worse today," Caleb said finally. "The bruising always darkens before it fades. Doc Avery in town could—" "No doctor." "All right." He didn't push, didn't ask why. Just accepted it and moved on. And Eliza felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even known was clenched. "I'll be working the south fence this afternoon," he said, standing. "Brutus stays with you. He barks if anyone comes within a quarter mile." "You think someone might come?" Virgil Kane doesn't hear the word no real well. And if Mercer decides he wants his property back, I'm not his property. I know that. But men like Mercer don't always agree with what we know. He left. Brutus settled on the porch like a sentinel, and Eliza continued her war against 5 years of bachelor neglect, working room by room through the house. That's when she found the first ghost. It was a handkerchief, tucked behind a shelf in the main room. Fine cotton, embroidered with the initials H.D. in thread that had once been blue, but faded to gray. Hannah Dunn. Eliza held it in her hands and felt the weight of a dead woman's presence settle over the house like dust. She found more as the day went on. A dried wildflower pressed between the pages of a book on animal husbandry. A single pearl earring fallen behind the bedroom dresser. A woman's hair ribbon caught in the back of a kitchen drawer. Each one a small testament to someone who had lived here, loved here, and then stopped. Eliza put each item carefully on the mantelpiece, a row of tiny memorials. She didn't know if Caleb would want to see them or not, but hiding the dead felt wrong. The dead deserved to be acknowledged, even if acknowledging them hurt. When Caleb came in at sundown, he stopped in front of the mantelpiece. His face did something complicated, a whole war fought behind those storm-water eyes in the space of 3 seconds. Then he reached out and touched the handkerchief with one finger. "Hannah's," he said. "I found them while I was cleaning. I can put them away if—" "No, leave them." He pulled his hand back. "She'd have liked you. She was practical like you. Couldn't stand a dirty kitchen." He sat down to dinner. Eliza had made stew from salt pork and the beans, thick and peppery, the way she guessed a working man would want it. Cornbread on the side. Coffee, strong enough to strip paint. "This is good," Caleb said after 3 bites. "Really good. My mother taught me before she died. I was 14. After that I cooked for my father and 3 brothers. Then for a boarding house in Columbus. Then for—" She stopped. "For Mercer. For 3 days. He didn't actually want me to cook. He wanted—" She set down her fork. "He wanted a body in his bed that couldn't say no, because he'd paid for it." Caleb's knuckles went white on his spoon. He set it down carefully, the way a man sets down something when he's afraid his hands might do something else entirely. "How much did he pay?" "For my passage? $40. He called it an investment. Said I owed him a return." $40. Caleb's voice was very quiet. A man buys a woman for $40 and thinks he owns her. The law agreed with him. We were married. What a husband does to his wife in their own home isn't anyone's business. That's what the sheriff in Tucson told me when I tried to report what Mercer did the second night. "You went to the sheriff?" "Crawled there, on my hands and knees, in my nightgown. He sent me back." Eliza picked up her fork again. Eating hurt, but she'd learned to eat through pain. "That was the night I understood that the law isn't justice. The law is just men deciding which other men get to do what they want." They finished dinner in a different kind of silence, heavier, charged with things neither of them was ready to say. Caleb washed dishes while Eliza dried, side by side at the counter, close enough to touch, but careful not to. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" "Tell me about Hannah." His hands went still in the water. She watched him decide, watched the battle between the wall he'd built and the door she was knocking on. "Not tonight," he said. "But I will. You've earned that." "I haven't earned anything. You don't owe me your pain just because I showed you mine." He turned to look at her, and something in his face shifted. "Nobody's ever said that to me before. Everybody in this town thinks they're owed my story. You're the first person who said they're not." "Because I know what it's like to have people pick through your worst moments like they're shopping at a market." Caleb dried his hands on his trousers. "Good night, Eliza." It was the first time he'd used her given name. She felt it land like a pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples in every direction. "Good night, Caleb." She went to her room, locked the door, listened to his footsteps cross the main room, the creak of his chair, the sound of a book being opened. He read every night, she was learning. Slowly, carefully, the way some men drank, savoring each page. She pressed her ear to the door and let the sound of his quiet breathing become the rhythm she fell asleep to. The days found their pattern. Eliza rose before dawn, had coffee ready when Caleb came in from his first round of the horses. He ate whatever she'd prepared, left a note if he'd be gone long, and worked until the sun told him to stop. She conquered the house room by room, reclaimed the garden from the desert's grip, learned which hens laid and which ones didn't, figured out that Brutus would eat anything except carrots, and that the black mare in the corral liked to be talked to while being brushed. Her bruises faded, green to yellow to nothing. Her ribs still ached when she reached too high or laughed too hard, which wasn't often because neither of them laughed much. But the swelling in her eye went down, and one morning she looked in the mirror and saw her own face again. Thinner and older than the girl who'd left Ohio, but recognizable. Still here, still standing. She learned Caleb's habits the way you learn weather patterns, by observation and patience. He liked his eggs over easy. He drank coffee black. He hung his hat on the same hook every time he entered the house, and if someone moved it, he'd stand in the doorway looking lost until he found it. He talked to his horses, but rarely to people. He whittled in the evenings, small animals mostly, and left them on the porch rail like offerings to something he couldn't name. He learned hers, that she hummed when she thought he wasn't listening, that she wrote letters at the kitchen table after dinner, letters she never mailed, addressed to brothers she hadn't seen in years, that she flinched when doors slammed, even from wind, that she always sat facing the exit. It was a Thursday, 10 days after her arrival, when Virgil Kane decided to test the boundaries. Brutus started barking first, sharp and urgent, the bark that meant stranger, not the bark that meant rabbit. Eliza was in the garden, hands in the dirt, coaxing life back into tomato plants that had nearly given up. She stood and saw the rider coming from the direction of town. Not Caleb. Too broad. Wrong horse. Wrong posture. Virgil Kane pulled up at the fence and smiled down at her like he owned the view. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hartwell. Thought I'd ride out and see how you're settling in." "Mr. Dunn isn't here." "I know. Saw him heading toward the North Ridge about an hour ago. Long ride from there." Virgil dismounted, hooked his reins over the fence post. "Figured you and I could talk without him hovering." Brutus planted himself between Eliza and the gate, head low, hackles up, producing a growl that came from somewhere deep and ancient. "Say what you came to say from right there," Eliza told him. "Now that's not very hospitable." Virgil leaned against the fence, casual as a snake sunning itself. "I came with a business proposition. $5 a day. That's what my best girls earn. You're damaged goods right now, I'll grant you that. But you'll heal up pretty enough. Could make real money. Enough to actually go somewhere. Start over, proper." "I've started over. Right here." "Here?" Virgil laughed. "Playing house with a man who can't even keep a wife alive? You know about Hannah Dunn, don't you?" Eliza's hands went cold despite the October sun. "Oh, I can see you don't know everything." Virgil's smile sharpened. "She killed herself, sweetheart. Hung herself, right there in that barn," he pointed. "Caleb found her swinging when he rode in from town. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? What kind of man drives his wife to a rope?" "You're lying." "Ask anyone in town. Ask Nell Buchanan, she knows. Ask Doc Avery. He cut the body down." Virgil straightened, brushing dust from his sleeves. A man whose wife chooses death over living with him. And now he's got you locked away out here, miles from anyone who could hear you scream. "Get off this property." "I'm going. Just wanted to plant a seed. When that seed grows into doubt, and it will, my offer stands." He mounted his horse. $5 a day, Eliza. Better than whatever Caleb Dunn is paying you to replace his dead wife." He rode away. Eliza stood in the garden with dirt on her hands and terror in her chest, and stared at the barn. Ordinary in the afternoon light. A barn. Just a barn. But now she saw the beam inside, the one that ran the width of the ceiling, and she imagined a rope, a body, a man walking in to find the worst thing he would ever see. She looked at the house, at the room with 2 exits that Caleb had given her, at the porch where he left trays of food and walked away, at every gentle, careful, thoughtful thing he'd done since the moment she said no, on Copper Bluff's Main Street. Were those the actions of a man who'd driven his wife to death? Or the actions of a man trying desperately to do better this time? Trying to give another woman what he hadn't given Hannah? Brutus whined and pressed against her leg. She buried her hand in his fur and waited for her heart to slow down. When Caleb came home that evening, she watched him the way she'd once watched Mercer, looking for tells, looking for the crack in the mask. He hung his hat, he washed his hands. He sat down to the dinner she'd prepared and ate with the same quiet gratitude he always showed. "Someone came today," Eliza said. Caleb looked up. His eyes went hard. "Who?" "Virgil Kane." Fork down, hands flat on the table. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, but his voice stayed level. "What did he want?" "To offer me a job, and to tell me about Hannah." The air left the room. Caleb sat perfectly still for a long time, and Eliza counted the seconds the way she used to count the seconds between Mercer's drinks, measuring how close the storm was. But the storm didn't come. Instead, Caleb stood slowly and walked to the door. "I need to check the horses," he said quietly. "Caleb." He stopped, but didn't turn around. "I'm not asking you to tell me tonight, but I need to know eventually. I need to know who I'm living with." "You're living with a man who failed his wife," Caleb said to the doorframe. "That's all there is to know." He went out. She cleaned up dinner alone, listening to the sound of him brushing horses in the corral with long mechanical strokes. The kind of work you do when your hands need to move, or they'll tear something apart. She was in her room, trying to read by lamplight, but mostly just staring at the wall, when the knock came. Soft. The knock of a man who'd rather do anything else. "Eliza." She opened the door. Caleb stood there, hat in his hands, looking like he'd aged 10 years since dinner. "Hannah didn't kill herself because of me," he said. "Not the way Virgil means it. I never raised a hand to her, never spoke a cruel word. But she died because I failed her, and that's a fact I'll carry to my grave." "Tell me," he told her, standing in that doorway, gripping his hat like it was the only thing keeping him upright. They'd lived in Tennessee. He'd been a blacksmith, well-respected, making good money. Hannah was a teacher, gentle and smart, the kind of woman who found beauty in everything and trusted that the world would return the favor. There was a man in town, wealthy, connected, the kind of man who took what he wanted because no one had ever told him no. "He came to the shop one day when I was delivering an order 3 towns over," Caleb said. His voice was stripped bare, no emotion left, just bone-dry fact. Hannah was alone. He came to the shop, and he took what he wanted from her, and he left her on the floor. Eliza's hand found the doorframe and held on. "She told me when I got home. I wanted to kill him, wanted it more than I've ever wanted anything. But Hannah begged me not to. Said he owned the sheriff, the judge, half the town. Said it would only make things worse. Said she just wanted to forget. But she couldn't forget. She couldn't forget. And I couldn't fix it. I couldn't fix her." His voice cracked on the word, the first crack she'd heard. "She got pregnant from it, from what he did, and she couldn't bear the thought of carrying his child. She went to the barn one morning while I was shoeing horses, not 50 yards away. I didn't hear anything. Didn't hear the chair kick. Didn't hear— Stop, Eliza said. You don't have to. I do. You asked who you're living with, and this is who. A man who is 50 yards away while his wife died.
A man who chose to respect her wishes instead of fighting for her. A man who— Eliza reached out and took his hand. His fingers were trembling. This strong man who could shoe a horse one-handed and stare down Virgil Kane without blinking, trembling like a child. You are not the man who hurt her, Eliza said. You are the man she trusted enough to tell. That's not failure. That's love. Love that wasn't enough. Sometimes nothing is enough. That's not your fault. That's the world's fault. They stood there in the doorway of her small room, his hand in hers, and Eliza felt something shift between them. Not romance. Not yet. Something more fundamental. Recognition. Two people who'd been broken by violence, looking at each other's jagged edges and seeing how they might, eventually, fit together. What happened to the man? She asked. Caleb's expression went flat. He died. Shot by someone unknown a week after Hannah's funeral. I was suspected. Couldn't prove it. I left Tennessee the next day and never went back. Did you kill him? I rode to his house that night with every intention of putting a bullet in his heart. When I got there, he was already dead on his porch. Someone beat me to it. I don't know who. He released her hand gently and stepped back. Now you know. If you want to leave, I'll drive you to town in the morning. No hard feelings. Caleb Dunn, if I was going to run from damaged men, I'd have started running a long time ago. I'm staying. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, put his hat on, and walked to his room. And Eliza stood in the kitchen, listening to the silence of a house that held two people's worth of ghosts, and thought that maybe, this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of someone willing to sit with you inside it. She locked her door from habit, lay down on her narrow bed, pressed her hand to her ribs where the bones were finally starting to knit. And she thought about Hannah Dunn, who had trusted the world and been destroyed by it. And about herself, who had trusted a letter and been destroyed by it. And about Caleb, who trusted nothing anymore, but had opened his door anyway. Brutus shifted on the porch between their two rooms. Outside, a coyote howled, and another answered, and the desert did what the desert always does. It held its secrets and waited for morning. Eliza found the journal on a Sunday. She'd been cleaning the top shelf of the bedroom closet, the one room she'd been avoiding because it was clearly Caleb's, and she didn't want to cross the line between housekeeper and intruder. But dust didn't respect boundaries, and neither did the mice that had been nesting in the corners, so she'd finally steeled herself and gone in with a broom and a bucket and a determination to make the space livable. The journal was wrapped in oilcloth, tucked behind a stack of old almanacs, leather-bound, water-stained, with a woman's handwriting on the first page. Hannah Dunn. Her Thoughts, 1872. Eliza held it like it might burn her. She should put it back. She should absolutely put it back. She brought it to Caleb that evening. I found this, she said, setting it on the dinner table between their plates. In the closet. I wasn't snooping. I was cleaning. Caleb stared at the journal. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth and stayed there, suspended, like time itself had gotten stuck. Hannah's, he said. I didn't open it. He set down his fork, pushed his plate away, sat there looking at that small leather book like it was a rattlesnake coiled on his kitchen table. I tried to read it, he said, after she died. Got 3 pages in and couldn't breathe. Haven't touched it since. I'll put it back. No.
He picked it up, turned it over in his rough hands.
Maybe someone should read it. Maybe her words deserve to be heard, even if I can't be the one to hear them. He held it out to Eliza. Would you? Caleb, I can't read your wife's private.
She's dead, Eliza. Privacy doesn't mean much to the dead, but being forgotten does. Hannah was more than what happened to her. She was smart and funny, and she drew little birds in the margins of everything she wrote. Someone should know that. Eliza took the journal. That night, after Caleb had gone to his room and the house settled into its quiet rhythms, she lit her lamp and opened the first page. Hannah Dunn wrote the way she apparently lived, with warmth and precision, and an eye for the small, beautiful things that most people walked past without seeing. The early entries were full of light, descriptions of wildflowers she'd found on the property, a funny story about Caleb burning his own dinner 3 nights in a row before she'd taught him that beans needed water to cook properly, a sketch of Brutus as a puppy, all ears and enormous paws. Caleb makes me laugh, Hannah wrote in an entry dated spring of 1873. Not on purpose. He doesn't know he's funny, which is what makes it perfect. He tried to fix the kitchen pump today and ended up flooding the floor. Stood there dripping like a caught fish and said, "Well, the pump works now." I laughed until my ribs hurt. He looked at me like I'd handed him the moon. Eliza touched the words and ached for this woman she'd never met. This woman who'd loved the same quiet man and been loved back in the only way he knew how. Through action, through presence, through standing steady in a world that kept trying to knock everyone down. The entries changed after the assault. Not immediately. Hannah had tried to keep writing about flowers and birds and Caleb's disasters in the kitchen. But the sentences grew shorter. The sketches disappeared. And then came the entry that made Eliza close the journal and press her hands to her mouth. I cannot wash him off my skin. I scrub until I bleed, and still I feel his hands. Caleb watches me with those helpless eyes, and I want to scream at him that watching isn't enough. But it's not his fault. He would have killed the man if I'd let him. Maybe I should have let him. Maybe blood is the only soap that works on this kind of stain. Eliza read until her lamp guttered low, following Hannah's descent the way you follow a river, knowing it leads to a falls. The final entries were sparse, sometimes just a line or two, the handwriting deteriorating as Hannah's mind unraveled. The last entry was 3 words. Forgive me, Caleb. Eliza closed the journal and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the distance between those early laughing entries and those final 3 words. Thinking about what violence does to joy, how it doesn't just damage the body, but poisons everything it touches, turning laughter to silence and trust to ash. She thought about her own silence in Mercer's rooms, the way she'd stopped speaking by the 2nd night, stopped looking at him by the 3rd, had already begun the process of disappearing into herself that Hannah had completed with a rope. The difference between them was luck, nothing more. Mercer had thrown her away. Hannah's attacker had kept coming back. That was the only reason Eliza was alive to read this journal. And the randomness of it, the pure, senseless chance, made her so angry she had to get up and pace her small room until the feeling passed. In the morning, she found Caleb at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, watching the door to her room. "You read it," he said, not a question. "Yes." "And?" Eliza sat down across from him. "She loved you. Start to finish, through everything, she loved you. And she didn't blame you, not once, not in a single entry." Caleb's jaw worked. He looked down at his coffee, looked at the wall, looked everywhere except at Eliza. "She blamed herself," he said. "Didn't she? She blamed the man who hurt her, and she blamed a world that let him do it without consequence. Same thing. No, Caleb, it's not the same thing at all. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking his chair over. I need to get to the horses. He grabbed his hat from the hook and was halfway out the door when he stopped. Thank you for reading it, for telling me what she said. There's something else. Eliza hesitated. This wasn't hers to share, but Caleb had carried false guilt long enough. She was pregnant, Caleb, from the attack. She wrote about it in the last weeks. She couldn't bear, I know. His back was to her, rigid as iron. I found the doctor's notes after. I just didn't know she'd written about it. She said you couldn't have saved her. She said the decision was hers and hers alone. People who are drowning don't get to decide they're not drowning. He left. The door closed behind him with a care that was somehow worse than a slam, because it meant he was holding himself together with everything he had, and the effort was costing him more than he could afford. Eliza washed the breakfast dishes and cried into the dishwater. For Hannah, for Caleb, for herself, for every woman who'd ever been broken by a man's hands and left to sweep up the pieces alone. 3 weeks passed. October hardened into early November. The bruises on Eliza's body had faded to nothing, though her ribs still complained when she reached too high or twisted too fast. She and Caleb had fallen into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing, as necessary as water. He brought her peppermint drops every time he went to town. She mended his shirts without being asked. He built a shelf in her room for the books she'd borrowed from Nell Buchanan. She left a plate warming on the stove when he worked late. Neither of them spoke about what these small gestures meant, because naming it might break it. And what they had was too fragile and too precious to risk. It was a Tuesday when Caleb came back from town with news that changed everything. Mercer's dead. Eliza was kneading bread. Her hands stopped in the dough. How? Card game in Tucson. Accused a man of cheating. Drew on him. The other man was faster. Caleb set a bag of flour on the counter. Virgil Kane brought the news. Seemed real pleased to be the one delivering it. Eliza pulled her hands from the dough. She waited to feel something. Relief, triumph, grief, anything. But there was only a vast emptiness, like a room that had been cleared of furniture. I'm a widow, she said. Seems so. I should feel something. You feel whatever you feel. There's no right answer. She looked at her flour-covered hands, the hands Mercer had stepped on when she'd crawled toward the door that second night. The pinky finger on her right hand still didn't bend properly where he'd broken it. She flexed it now, feeling the wrongness of the joint, and suddenly the emptiness filled with something hot and sharp and enormous. I'm glad, she said, and her voice cracked like glass. I'm glad he's dead. Is that wrong? To be glad a man is dead? If it's wrong, then I'm wrong too. I was glad when Hannah's man died. I'm not crying for him, she said, because the tears were coming now, fast and unstoppable. I'm crying for the girl who left Ohio, thinking she was going to have a life, a house, children, someone who'd see her as more than a pair of hands and a body to use. I'm crying for her because she's gone and she's never coming back. She's not entirely gone, Caleb said quietly. I see her sometimes. When you're singing in the garden. When you argue with the chickens about where they should lay. She's still in there, just wiser now. Eliza wiped her face with her forearm, leaving a streak of flour across her cheek. Caleb Dunn, that might be the most words you've ever said at one time. Don't get used to it. But something had shifted, the way a river shifts course after a storm. Not dramatically, but permanently. Mercer was dead. The threat of him coming to claim her, the nightmare she hadn't admitted she carried, was gone. And in the space his death created, something else began to grow. That night, Caleb built a fire in the yard. He brought out Eliza's stack of unmailed letters and her ruined wedding dress, which she'd kept folded in the bottom of her trunk because she couldn't explain, even to herself, why she hadn't thrown it away. "You don't have to," he said, "but if you want to." Eliza fed the letters to the fire first, then the dress. The ivory silk caught and blazed, sending sparks spiraling into the cold November sky. She watched 3 days of marriage turn to ash and felt the weight lift from her shoulders like a physical thing. Pounds of grief and shame and fear burning away with the fabric. "Hannah kept hers," Caleb said, watching the fire. "Her wedding dress. I found it folded in tissue paper after. She'd kept it perfect, even after everything. Because the marriage wasn't what hurt her. The marriage was the good part." Caleb looked at her sharply. "How'd you know that?" "Because she wrote it, in the journal. She said loving you was the one thing that stayed clean." He turned back to the fire. They stood side by side, not touching, but closer than they'd ever stood before. Close enough that when the wind shifted, Eliza could feel the heat of his body through her sleeve. "I need to tell you something," Caleb said. "All right." "A woman named Agnes Whitfield has been writing letters to every marshal in the territory. She was married to the man who attacked Hannah, remarried now to someone with money and influence. She claims I killed her first husband, and she wants me extradited to Tennessee to stand trial." The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. Eliza felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "When did you find out?" "A month ago, before you came. Marshal Thompson in town warned me. Said she'd hired lawyers, bought a witness. A man named Sykes, who claims I paid him to do the killing." "Did you?" "No, I told you. When I got to the man's property, he was already dead. But Sykes will say whatever Agnes Whitfield pays him to say, and she's paying plenty." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you'd just arrived, broken and bleeding, and the last thing you needed was my problems on top of your own." Eliza turned to face him fully. The firelight carved shadows across his face, and she could see the exhaustion there, the weight of a threat he'd been carrying alone, because carrying things alone was all he knew how to do. "Don't you ever do that again," she said. "Do what?" "Decide what I can handle. I crawled out of Douglas Mercer's rooms on my hands and knees. I rode 3 days in a stagecoach with broken ribs. I am not fragile, Caleb. I am not Hannah." The words hung between them, and she wished she could take back the last 3, because she saw them land like blows on his already battered heart. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant." His voice was rough. "And you're right. I've been protecting you the way I should have protected Hannah, and that's not fair to either of you. You're your own woman. You deserve to know what's coming." "What's coming?" "Marshal Thompson says federal men might ride out before Christmas. If Agnes Whitfield gets a sympathetic judge, I could be arrested, taken to Tennessee, tried for murder." He paused. "Hanged." The word landed between them like a stone thrown into still water. "Then we need to be ready," Eliza said. "We? You think I'm going to stand in this yard and watch them take you away? You think I'm going to let some rich woman's revenge destroy the one good thing I found in 26 years of living? Eliza, don't you Eliza me. You pulled me out of the dirt. You gave me a door that locks. You fed me soup when I couldn't feed myself. You treated me like a person when every other man in that town was treating me like merchandise." She stepped forward, close enough now that the fire lit both their faces. "I don't know what this is between us. I don't know what to call it. But I know I'm not losing it to a dead man's widow and a bought witness." Caleb stared at her. This woman who'd arrived on his land barely able to stand, who'd scrubbed his kitchen while her ribs screamed, who'd read his dead wife's journal and wept for a woman she'd never met, who stood here now, fierce as any soldier he'd ever seen, declaring war on his behalf. "You scare me," he said quietly.
Good. And then, because the fire was dying and the cold was coming, and some things can only be held back so long, Caleb Dunn reached out and took Eliza Hartwell's hand. Not her arm, the way he had that first day, impersonal and practical. Her hand. Fingers lacing through fingers, his rough palm against her rough palm. Two people who worked hard and hurt deeply, and had somehow found each other in the middle of nowhere. "Whatever comes," he said. "Together," she finished. They stood there until the last ember went dark, and the desert cold drove them inside. At the door, Caleb paused. "Thank you," he said, "for staying. Thank you for being worth staying for." He went to his room. She went to hers. Two locked doors in a house that was learning to breathe again. But something had changed, and they both knew it. Felt it humming in the air between them like a wire pulled taut. Eliza lay in bed and pressed her hand to her chest where her heart was beating hard and fast, and thought about what she'd said to him. "I don't know what this is between us." That was a lie. She knew exactly what it was. She just wasn't ready to say it out loud. Because the last time she'd trusted a feeling like this, it had cost her everything. But Caleb wasn't Mercer. Caleb was the man who left peppermint drops on her tray, and built shelves for her books, and told her the truth about his worst moments because she'd asked, and he respected her enough to answer. Somewhere outside, Brutus shifted on the porch. The coyotes sang their nightly chorus, and in the barn where Hannah Dunn had made her final, desperate choice, an owl settled on the beam and called out into the darkness, asking the question that owls have always asked. Who? 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 Eliza closed her eyes and whispered to the darkness the same thing she'd whispered that first night, though the meaning had changed entirely. "Thank you. Not for shelter this time. Not for safety or soup or a locked door, but for the terrifying, beautiful, impossible thing growing in the space between two damaged hearts that had somehow, against all odds and reason, chosen each other." The federal men came on a Monday, 3 weeks before Christmas. Eliza heard them before she saw them. Hoofbeats on frozen ground. Too many to be one rider. Too deliberate to be passing through. Brutus erupted from the porch with the bark that meant danger. The bark that came from his chest instead of his throat. And Eliza dropped the shirt she was mending and reached for the shotgun Caleb had taught her to use. She'd practiced every afternoon for 2 weeks, firing at tin cans on the fence rail until her shoulder bruised from the kick. Caleb hadn't asked why she wanted to learn. He'd just handed her the gun and shown her how to hold it. "Brace with your back foot," he'd said. "Don't close your eyes. The thing you're shooting at won't disappear just because you stop looking." That advice applied to more than guns. Caleb came from the barn at a dead run, rifle already in his hands. He positioned himself between the approaching riders and the house, and Eliza moved to the porch, shotgun cradled the way he'd taught her. Not aimed, not threatening, just present. 4 riders. The lead man wore a federal marshal's star. Behind him, 2 deputies with the dead-eyed look of men who'd rather be anywhere else. And behind them, in a hired carriage that looked absurd on the rough desert road, sat a woman Eliza had never seen. Blonde hair in elaborate curls. Black mourning dress that cost more than most people earned in a year. A face that might have been beautiful if hatred hadn't carved permanent lines around the mouth. Agnes Whitfield had come in person. "Caleb Dunn," the marshal called out. Young for the badge, 30 at most, with a mustache he was clearly proud of, and an authority he wore like a borrowed coat. "I'm Federal Marshal Raymond Cross. I have a warrant for your questioning in connection with the murder of Garrett Whitfield in Knoxville, Tennessee.
September of 1877. I've been questioned before, Caleb said. Marshal Thompson found nothing. New evidence, Mr. Dunn. Cross produced a folded document. A sworn affidavit from one Lester Sykes, who claims you paid him $50 to kill Whitfield on the night in question. Lester Sykes is a liar. That's for a court to determine. Cross glanced at Eliza on the porch. Mrs. Dunn? Mrs. Coleman. Eliza Hartwell. She didn't correct the assumption further. Let them wonder. Agnes Whitfield stepped down from the carriage, and up close, she was harder than Eliza had expected. Not fragile. Not grieving. Armored. This was a woman who'd turned her dead husband's memory into a weapon and intended to use it.
"So this is where you've been hiding," Agnes said, looking at Caleb the way you'd look at something stuck to your shoe. "Plain rancher, plain house with another damaged woman."
Mrs. Whitfield, Marshal Cross warned. My husband was murdered, Marshal. I have a right to face the man who did it. Your husband raped my friend's wife, Eliza said from the porch, her voice carrying clean across the yard. He raped her until she couldn't live with what he'd done. Whatever happened to him, he built it with his own hands. Agnes turned that armored gaze on Eliza. And who are you to speak about my husband? Some mail-order whore who couldn't keep her own man happy for 3 days? The word hit like a slap, but Eliza had taken real slaps from a man twice Agnes's size and stayed standing. I'm the woman standing on this porch with a shotgun, Eliza said evenly. And you're the woman standing in my yard insulting me. One of us should reconsider her position.
"That a threat, ma'am?" one of the deputies asked, hand moving toward his holster.
It's geography, Eliza replied. I'm on my property. She's on it too, uninvited. Marshal Cross dismounted, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation he'd ridden into. Mr. Dunn, I need to search the property, and I need you both to answer questions. We can do this civil, or we can do it difficult. Your choice. Search, Caleb said. I've got nothing to hide. They searched for 2 hours. Every room, every shelf, every corner of the barn and outbuildings. Eliza stood on the porch and watched strangers rifle through the home she'd built from chaos. Watched them open her dresser drawers and flip through her books and handle the small whittled animals Caleb left on the porch rail. When one deputy headed for her room, Caleb stepped forward. She goes with you, he told Cross. That's her private space. She has a right to be present. Cross nodded.
Eliza followed the deputy into her small room and stood in the doorway while he searched, her face burning as he moved through her few possessions. He paused at Hannah's journal on the nightstand. What's this? A dead woman's diary. Hannah Dunn's. Caleb gave it to me to read because he couldn't bring himself to. The deputy opened it, scanned a few pages. His expression shifted from professional interest to something softer. This talks about Whitfield, what he did. Yes, this could be considered motive evidence, or proof that Caleb Dunn tried to handle it through legal channels instead of violence. Read the entries from April. Hannah writes about Caleb going to the sheriff, then the judge, then a lawyer in Nashville. Every legal door was slammed in his face because Whitfield owned the town. The deputy closed the journal and, to her surprise, handed it back. They found nothing. No .44 caliber Smith & Wesson, which Cross said was the murder weapon. No blood-stained clothing. No evidence of any kind connecting Caleb to Garrett Whitfield's death beyond motive, which half the county shared. Agnes Whitfield's composure began to crack as the search produced nothing. He's hidden it, she insisted. He's had 5 years to get rid of evidence. But Sykes will testify. A jury will convict. Based on a single witness of questionable character? Caleb said quietly. A man who's been in and out of jail his whole life? A man who will say anything for money. Don't you dare impugn my witness. Your witness, Mrs. Whitfield. You just admitted he's yours.
Agnes flushed. Marshal Cross stepped between them. "I've seen enough for today. Mr. Dunn, you're not under arrest, but you're not to leave the territory. Mrs. Whitfield is filed for extradition to Tennessee, and a federal judge will hear the case in Tucson in 3 weeks." "Tennessee," Caleb said, "where the Whitfield family owns the courts." "That's the process, Mr. Dunn.
Get yourself a lawyer." Cross mounted his horse. "Ma'am," he said to Eliza, touching his hat, "I'd recommend you distance yourself from this situation. If it goes badly, association with Mr. Dunn could—" "Could what? Ruin my reputation?" Eliza laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut. "Marshal, I arrived in this territory beaten half to death in a torn wedding dress. My reputation and I have already had our reckoning. We came to terms." Cross shook his head and rode away with his deputies. Agnes lingered, standing by her carriage, staring at Caleb with an intensity that made Eliza's skin crawl. "She screamed, you know," Agnes said softly, "when she was dying. Your wife. Hanging isn't quiet the way people think. There's choking and kicking and sounds that aren't—" Caleb moved so fast Eliza barely saw it. Not toward Agnes, toward the barn. He walked in and shut the door behind him and didn't come out. Agnes smiled. Mission accomplished. "You feel good about that?" Eliza asked. "Torturing a man with his dead wife's suffering?" "I feel good about justice." "You don't know the first thing about justice. Justice would have been your husband in prison for what he did to Hannah Dunn and every other woman he destroyed. Justice would have been someone stopping him before he ruined lives. What you want isn't justice. It's revenge dressed up in widow's weeds." Agnes's smile vanished. "Be careful, Mrs. Hartwell. I have resources you can't imagine. And I have nothing left to lose. Which one of us do you think fights harder?" Agnes got into her carriage and left. Eliza found Caleb sitting on the barn floor, his back against the wall directly beneath the beam. He was staring at the spot where Hannah had died, his rifle across his knees, his face empty of everything. She sat down beside him, not touching, just there. "She said that to hurt you," Eliza said. "She said it because it's true. I've imagined it 1,000 times. The sounds, His voice broke. "I was 50 yards away, shoeing a goddamn horse." "Caleb, look at me." He turned his head. His eyes were dry, but that was worse somehow. Tears would have meant the grief was moving through him. This dry, hollow stare meant it was just sitting there, like poison. "We are going to fight this," Eliza said. "Not for your guilt, not for Hannah's memory. For us. For whatever this is that we're building here. Agnes Whitfield doesn't get to take that away. If I hang, you won't. But if I do, the ranch is paid for. I'll sign it over to you. You'll have a home." "I don't want your ranch, Caleb. I want you alive and sitting across from me at that kitchen table for the next 40 years. Can you give me that?" "I don't know." "Then we'd better get to work figuring out how." The next 3 days were the longest of Eliza's life. She wrote to every lawyer in the territory, getting names from Nell Buchanan and Doc Avery and anyone else who might know. Caleb worked the ranch in grim silence, pushing himself harder than necessary, punishing his body for sins his mind wouldn't let go of. On the 3rd morning, Brutus started barking again, but this time his tail was wagging. A lone rider coming from the south, moving fast on a tired horse. Eliza stepped onto the porch, and the breath left her body. "Isaac," she whispered. Then louder, running. "Isaac!" Her brother dismounted and caught her in his arms, and for a moment, Eliza was 12 years old again, hiding behind her older brother while their father raged, trusting that Isaac's body between her and danger was all the shield she'd ever need. "Easy, Lizzie." He held her at arm's length, looking her over with eyes that had seen too much war and too much road. "You look better than I expected. From what I heard in Tucson, I thought I'd find a corpse." "How did you find me?" "Tracked you from the stage line. Took me 2 months." Isaac Hartwell was 30, lean as a wolf, with their mother's dark hair and their father's stubborn jaw. He'd fought at Chickamauga at 17 and come home at 20 with a limp and a silence that never fully lifted. "Heard about Mercer dying. Good riddance. Also heard you're living with a man named Dunn who's got federal trouble." "Isaac, this is Caleb." She turned as Caleb approached, and she saw the two men measure each other in the way men do, all instinct and calculation. "You the one who pulled my sister off the street?" Isaac asked. "I offered her a job. She did the pulling herself." "He's being modest," Eliza said. "I doubt that." Isaac didn't smile, but something in his eyes approved. "We need to talk. Inside." They sat at the kitchen table, and Isaac dropped a bombshell that made the coffee in Eliza's cup tremble. "I know Lester Sykes," he said. "Know him personally. Played cards with him in Dodge City back in '77. September of '77, to be exact." Caleb went still. "What?" "September 15th through 18th. Sykes and I spent 3 days in Dodge City jail for brawling after a poker game. I accused him of cheating, which he was. He accused me of the same, which I was. Sheriff locked us both up until we cooled off." Isaac pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Got a copy of the arrest record right here. Already sent a telegram to the Dodge City Sheriff asking for the official documents." "You're saying Sykes was in Kansas the night Whitfield died?" Eliza said slowly. "I'm saying Sykes was sitting across from me in a jail cell in Kansas the night Whitfield died. Couldn't have been in Tennessee paying anyone or seeing anything. Whatever Agnes Whitfield is paying him to say, it's a lie." Caleb stared at the paper. His hands were shaking. "You're certain about the dates?" "I'm certain because the sheriff confiscated my lucky watch and wouldn't give it back until the 18th. I've got the claim receipt with a date on it." Isaac looked between them. "This Sykes character has been blackmailing someone too. Woman named Ruth Avery, Doc Avery's wife." Eliza's blood went cold. "How do you know that?" "Because when I was asking around town about Caleb's situation, Nell Buchanan pulled me aside and told me. Said Ruth's been paying Sykes small amounts for years to keep quiet about something she saw the night Whitfield died." "Ruth was Hannah's closest friend," Caleb said. "But she was in Memphis that week, visiting her sister. I checked." "Maybe she wasn't," Isaac said quietly. The silence in the kitchen was the loudest silence Eliza had ever heard. She looked at Caleb and saw the pieces falling together in his mind. The same pieces falling together in hers. Ruth Avery, Hannah's best friend. A woman who'd loved Hannah like a sister. A woman who'd watched Hannah deteriorate, watched the law fail, watched a good woman be destroyed by a monster the courts wouldn't touch. "Oh, God," Eliza whispered. Before anyone could speak further, a carriage pulled into the yard. Ruth Avery stepped down, medical bag in hand, a woman in her 40s who looked like she'd aged 10 years in the last 3 days. "I heard the marshal came," Ruth said without preamble, standing in the kitchen doorway. "I heard Agnes Whitfield is here. I heard about Sykes." "Ruth," Caleb started, "let me speak." She came inside, sat down at the table as if her legs couldn't hold her anymore, looked at Caleb with eyes that held 5 years of secrets. "Sykes has been blackmailing me because he saw me leaving Whitfield's property the night Garrett died. Not because I hired anyone, because I did it myself." Isaac's hand moved to his hip. Caleb stopped breathing. Eliza gripped the edge of the table. "I shot Garrett Whitfield twice in the chest with my father's pistol,"
Ruth said, her voice steady as stone.
Then I came to town and spent the rest of the night buying you drinks at the saloon, Caleb, making sure half the town saw you too drunk to ride, let alone shoot. I created your alibi because I'd already killed the man. You were in Memphis, Caleb said hoarsely. I sent letters from Memphis, had my sister mail them, but I came back 3 days early. I came back because Hannah wrote to me, a letter I never showed anyone. She told me what she was going to do, told me she couldn't stop it, begged me not to blame you. Ruth's composure cracked, and tears ran down her face. I was too late to save her. I got to your ranch an hour after you found her, but I wasn't too late for justice. You killed a man, Isaac said. I killed a rapist. I killed the man who destroyed my best friend, and I'd do it again tomorrow and sleep like a baby after. Ruth, Caleb's voice was wrecked. 5 years. You've carried this for 5 years. And I'd carry it 5 more. But Agnes Whitfield is going to get you hanged for something I did, and I won't allow that. Not when Hannah died, wishing she could have spared you pain. She looked at Eliza. You love him? Yes. Then help me protect him. If you confess, Eliza said carefully, Agnes will just say you're covering for Caleb. She'll say he convinced you to take the blame. I know. That's why I need another way. Ruth wiped her face. Isaac, your evidence about Sykes. If we can prove he's a fraud, Agnes's case collapses. The arrest records will be here within the week, Isaac confirmed. That destroys the witness. But Agnes won't stop. She'll find another angle, hire another liar. Ruth straightened. Unless the town stops her. What do you mean? Caleb asked. I mean Copper Bluff protects its own. You didn't kill Garrett Whitfield, Caleb. Everyone who matters knows that. And the people of this town owe you. You've mended their fences, shod their horses, sat up with their sick cattle. You pulled Eliza out of the dirt when every other man was circling her like vultures. This town owes you a debt, and I intend to collect it. Ruth stood, smoothing her dress with hands that had taken a life and kept the secret for half a decade. I'm going to talk to Nell Buchanan and Reverend Price, and every person in Copper Bluff who remembers what Garrett Whitfield was and what his widow is trying to do. When the federal judge comes, he won't just face a lying witness. He'll face a town. She left. The carriage wheels crunched on frozen ground and faded into distance. Isaac let out a long breath. That woman shot a man and kept it quiet for 5 years. She loved Hannah, Caleb said numbly. Maybe more than anyone. Maybe more than me. Don't do that, Eliza said sharply. Don't turn this into another way to punish yourself. Ruth made her choice, just like Hannah made hers, just like I made mine when I stepped off that stage. None of those choices are yours to carry. Caleb looked at her across the table where they'd shared 100 meals, where she'd told him about Mercer and he'd told her about Hannah, where they'd slowly and carefully built something neither of them had dared to hope for. What did I do to deserve you? He asked. You stood up, Eliza said simply. When every other man in that crowd was doing arithmetic on what a beaten woman was worth, you stood up and said no. That's what you did. Isaac cleared his throat. I'm going to check on my horse. You two need a minute. He walked out and closed the door behind him, and Caleb reached across the table and took both of Eliza's hands in his. If this goes wrong, he started. It won't. If it does, I need you to know that these months with you have been the first time in 5 years I felt like I'm actually alive. Not just existing, living. You did that. You and your singing and your arguing with chickens and your terrible coffee. My coffee is not terrible. It's terrible. I drink it because you make it, and that makes it perfect. She laughed, and the sound surprised them both. Laughter in the middle of crisis. Joy in the middle of fear. Caleb stood and pulled her to her feet, and held her the way he held everything that mattered to him. Carefully, completely, with his whole body committed to the act of not letting go. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I should have said it weeks ago." "You've been saying it," Eliza whispered against his chest. "Every peppermint drop, every shelf you built, every time you knocked before entering a room. You've been saying it since the day we met." "Then let me say it with words. I love you, Eliza Hartwell. Not because you replaced Hannah, not because you fixed my loneliness, because you are the bravest, stubbornest, most terrifying woman I've ever met, and I can't imagine going back to the silence before you." She pulled back to look at him, this man with storm-water eyes and calloused hands, and a heart so battered it was a miracle it still beat it all. "I love you too, Caleb Dunn. Now stop talking about hanging and help me figure out how to keep you alive." Outside, Isaac Hartwell leaned against the corral fence and scratched Brutus behind the ears, and watched the sun go down over a desert that kept its secrets better than anyone. "They'll be all right," he told the dog. "Both of them. I'll make sure of it." Brutus wagged his tail once and went back to guarding the porch, the way he'd guarded it every night since a broken woman arrived in a dead woman's dress, and a quiet man decided that this time, he would not fail. The arrest records arrived from Dodge City on a Thursday morning, carried by a rider who'd nearly killed his horse getting there. Isaac met him at the post office and brought the documents straight to the ranch, mud-splattered and grinning for the first time since Eliza had known him. "September 15th through 18th, 1877, he said, spreading the papers on the kitchen table. "Lester Sykes, detained for public brawling, released on the 18th upon payment of a $2 fine. Sheriff's signature, official seal, the whole works. Your boy Sykes was locked up in Kansas while he claims he was watching Caleb pay for a murder in Tennessee." Caleb read the document twice. His hands were steady, but a muscle worked in his jaw, the way it always did when he was holding something back. "This proves he's a liar," Caleb said. "Doesn't prove I'm innocent." "It proves Agnes Whitfield bought false testimony," Eliza said. "That's enough to destroy her case." "Eliza's right," Isaac said. "No witness, no case. But we need to play this smart. The federal judge arrives in Tucson next week. We present this evidence there, in open court, where Agnes can't bury it. And if she buys another witness, then she'll face a town." Ruth Avery's voice came from the doorway. She'd arrived without any of them hearing, which was becoming a habit. Behind her stood Nell Buchanan, Reverend Price, Doc Avery looking pale but resolute, and behind them, a half-dozen other faces Eliza recognized from town. "What is this?" Caleb asked. Nell Buchanan pushed past Ruth into the kitchen, filling the room with her considerable presence. "This is Copper Bluff, you stubborn fool. Did you think we'd let Agnes Whitfield drag you to a Tennessee gallows without a fight? I didn't ask for— No, you never do. That's your problem, Caleb Dunn. You'd rather drown than ask someone to throw you a rope." Nell set a basket on the counter. "I brought food. You're all going to eat, and then we're going to plan, because that woman arrives in Tucson with lawyers and money, and we arrive with the truth, and the truth needs organizing." They ate around Caleb's kitchen table, more people than had ever sat in that house at one time. Eliza watched Caleb's face as his neighbors crowded into his space, touching his things, filling his silence with their noise. He looked overwhelmed. He looked terrified. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a man who understood he wasn't alone. Doc Avery spoke first. "I examined Whitfield's body 5 years ago. The coroner in Knoxville asked for a second opinion because the wounds didn't match a typical gunfight. 2 shots, close range, upward angle.
The shooter was significantly shorter than Whitfield. He glanced at his wife. Caleb is 6 feet tall. The angle is wrong for him.
I also have medical records showing I treated Caleb for alcohol poisoning the morning after the killing, Doc Avery continued. He was in no condition to ride 20 miles, shoot straight, and ride back. The man could barely stand. "Because I was keeping his glass full all night," Ruth said quietly. Every head turned toward her. She sat very straight, hands folded, the perfect picture of a respectable doctor's wife. "I made sure Caleb stayed in that saloon where everyone could see him, made sure he drank enough that no one would believe he could have ridden anywhere." "Ruth," Doc Avery said, and there was a weight in that single word that told Eliza he'd figured it out. Maybe not just now. Maybe he'd known for years and loved his wife enough to carry the knowledge in silence. "Not here," Ruth said softly. "Not now. What matters now is Caleb." Reverend Price cleared his throat. He was a lean, weathered man who preached short sermons and kept long confidences. "I can testify to Caleb's character. 5 years in this community without a single act of violence. The man has helped every family in this town at one time or another. Built the Hendersons' barn after the fire. Sat with old Tom Mackey through 3 nights of fever. Pulled Jacob Buchanan's boy out of the creek when he fell through the ice. I didn't do those things for credit," Caleb said. "Nobody said you did," Nell replied. "That's exactly the point. You did them because you're decent. And decent men don't deserve to hang for crimes they didn't commit." They planned until dark. Isaac would present the Dodge City records. Doc Avery would testify about the medical evidence. Reverend Price would speak to character. Nell and half the town would be present to make sure the judge understood that Copper Bluff stood behind Caleb Dunn. After everyone left, Caleb sat on the porch in the cold December air. Eliza brought him coffee and sat beside him. Brutus lay at their feet. "I don't deserve this," Caleb said. "Deserve what?" "Any of it. These people, this town, you." "You're right. You don't deserve it. Nobody deserves love, Caleb. That's what makes it love instead of payment. It's given freely, or it isn't given at all." He reached for her hand in the darkness. She gave it. "Marry me," he said. Eliza's heart stopped. Restarted. Stopped again. "What?" "Before the hearing, before whatever happens in Tucson. Marry me. Not because it would help the case, though it would. Not because I need a wife. Because I love you, and I'm tired of pretending the space between your door and mine is anything but a waste of time." "Caleb Dunn, is that a proposal or an argument?" "It's a desperate request from a man who spent 5 years punishing himself for not fighting hard enough, and who's finally found something worth fighting for." Eliza looked at him in the thin moonlight. This man who'd offered her a door that locked, and peppermint drops, and the quiet, steady devotion of someone who'd rather die than raise his hand to a woman. She thought about the girl who'd left Ohio with a suitcase full of hope and a mail-order husband who'd beaten it out of her in 3 days. That girl would have said yes out of desperation. That girl would have said yes because she had nowhere else to go. Eliza Hartwell was not that girl anymore. "Yes," she said, "but not because I'm desperate. Not because I'm scared. Because I choose you. Because I choose this life with you. Because you are the first man who ever asked me what I wanted, instead of telling me." He kissed her, carefully at first, the way he did everything, with precision and intention. Then harder, deeper, 5 years of loneliness and 3 months of restraint breaking like a dam. When they pulled apart, Eliza was trembling, and it had nothing to do with the cold. "Tomorrow," Caleb said. "Reverend Price can do it tomorrow. Tomorrow, I'll have flour in my hair and chicken feed on my boots." "Good.
That's who you are. I don't want you in silk. I want you in cotton, with dirt under your nails, and that look in your eyes that makes men like Virgil Caine back up." She laughed, and the sound carried across the desert like something set free. The wedding was small. Reverend Price performed the ceremony in Copper Bluff's church, with Isaac standing as witness, Nell crying into a handkerchief, and half the town packed into the pews. Eliza wore her blue cotton dress, the one Nell had given her that first day. Caleb wore his church clothes and looked like he'd rather be breaking horses, which made Eliza love him more. When Reverend Price asked for rings, Caleb produced two: a plain gold band for himself, and for Eliza, a ring that made her breath catch. "It was Hannah's," he whispered so only she could hear. "Ruth kept it. Gave it to me this morning. Said Hannah would have wanted you to have it. Said love shouldn't be buried with the dead." Eliza looked at the delicate ring, a simple band with a tiny garnet, and felt the weight of what it meant. Not a replacement, not a hand-me-down, a passing of trust from one woman to another across the divide of death. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Hannah loved me enough to want me happy. You make me happy. She'd understand." She let him slide the ring onto her finger, and when Reverend Price pronounced them married, Caleb kissed her with a tenderness that made Nell sob louder and Isaac clear his throat and look at the ceiling. They had 3 days of peace. 3 days of being married, of sleeping in the same bed, of waking to each other's warmth. 3 days of Caleb smiling more than he had in 5 years, of Eliza humming while she cooked, of Brutus wagging his tail at both of them, like he'd been waiting for this all along. On the 4th day, they rode to Tucson for the hearing. The courtroom was hot and crowded. Agnes Whitfield sat in the front row, flanked by a lawyer in city clothes, and 2 men who looked like hired muscle, dressed in Sunday best. Marshall Cross sat to one side, looking like a man who wished he'd chosen a different profession. Federal Judge Harlan Moore was 60, silver-haired, with the face of a man who'd seen every kind of lie the human heart could produce and wasn't impressed by any of them. "This is an extradition hearing," Judge Moore said, "not a trial. I'm here to determine if there's sufficient cause to transport Mr. Dunn to Tennessee. Mrs. Whitfield, your counsel may proceed." Agnes's lawyer, a thin man named Prescott, who smelled of expensive tobacco and ambition, laid out the case. Garrett Whitfield, murdered. Caleb Dunn, the man with motive. And Lester Sykes, the witness who claimed Caleb had paid him to do the killing. "Where is Mr. Sykes?" Judge Moore asked. Prescott shifted. "Mr. Sykes was unable to travel, Your Honor. We have his sworn affidavit." "Unable or unwilling?" Isaac stood. "Your Honor, if I may. Isaac Hartwell. I have evidence proving that Lester Sykes's affidavit is fraudulent." Judge Moore raised an eyebrow. "Approach." Isaac presented the arrest records, the claim receipt for his watch, a telegram from the Dodge City Sheriff confirming the dates. He laid each document before the judge with the precision of a man who'd learned that battles were won with preparation, not passion. "September 15th, 1877, Isaac said. "Sykes and I were both sitting in a jail cell in Dodge City, Kansas. He couldn't have been in Tennessee witnessing anything, because he was too busy accusing me of cheating at poker, which I was." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Agnes Whitfield's face went white. "That's a forgery," Prescott said quickly. "These documents could have been fabricated." "By the sheriff of Dodge City?" Judge Moore examined the papers. "These carry an official seal and are corroborated by telegraph from a sitting law officer. Unless you're suggesting a conspiracy involving Kansas law enforcement, Mr. Prescott, I'd tread carefully." Doc Avery testified next. Medical evidence, the angle of the wounds, Caleb's condition the morning after. Ruth sat in the gallery, her face composed, watching her husband protect the man she'd killed for. Then Nell Buchanan took the stand, and after her, Josiah, and after him, the Hendersons and the Mackeys, and family after family from Copper Bluff, each one testifying to Caleb Dunn's character, his decency, his years of quiet service to a community that had taken him in without questions. Agnes Whitfield watched her case disintegrate one witness at a time. "Your Honor," Prescott tried again, The character of the accused is exactly what's at issue in an extradition hearing," Judge Moore said firmly. "I'm determining whether there's cause to believe this man committed murder. His character is directly relevant." "My husband was murdered," Agnes said, standing. Her voice broke. Whether from grief or rage, Eliza couldn't tell. "Someone killed him, and no one has paid for it. Doesn't that matter?" Judge Moore looked at her with something approaching pity. "It matters, Mrs. Whitfield. But justice is not achieved by punishing the wrong man. Your witness has been proven a liar. Your evidence is circumstantial at best. And the man you're accusing has an entire community willing to vouch for him. They're protecting a killer." "They're protecting a neighbor. There's a difference, though I understand you may not see it." Judge Moore straightened his papers. "This matter is dismissed. There is insufficient cause for extradition. Mr. Dunn, you're free to go. Mrs. Whitfield, if you pursue this further without credible evidence, I will consider sanctions for malicious prosecution." Agnes Whitfield stared at the judge, then at Caleb, then at the rows of Copper Bluff faces behind him. For one moment, her mask dropped entirely, and Eliza saw what was underneath. Not grief for a dead husband, not desire for justice, just loneliness. The vast, consuming loneliness of a woman who'd built her entire identity around a dead man's memory and had nothing left without it. "This isn't over," Agnes whispered. But it was. Everyone in that courtroom knew it, including Agnes herself. She gathered her lawyer and her hired men and walked out of the courtroom and out of their lives. A woman whose money and spite had finally met a wall they couldn't buy through. Outside, Copper Bluff celebrated in the way small towns do, with handshakes and backslaps and promises of whiskey at Murphy's, though someone remembered Caleb didn't drink and amended the offer to coffee. Ruth Avery found Eliza in the crowd. "It's done," she said. "Is it?" Eliza held Ruth's hands. "What about Sykes? He knows what you did. If Agnes pays him enough—" "Sykes has been discredited in federal court. Anything he says now will be dismissed as the testimony of a proven liar." Ruth smiled, and for the first time, Eliza saw peace in the older woman's eyes. "Hannah's monster is dead. His widow has been defeated, and the man Hannah loved is finally free to be happy." She squeezed Eliza's hands. "Make him happy, Eliza. He's waited long enough." The ride home was quiet. Isaac rode ahead, giving them space. Caleb held the reins in one hand and Eliza's hand in the other. "It's over," Eliza said. "The hearing is over. The rest is just beginning." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about what comes next. And I want to expand the ranch, run more cattle, build a proper house, not just patch the old one. Maybe add rooms." "Rooms? What for?" Caleb looked straight ahead, but a flush crept up his neck. "In case we need them. Someday." Eliza felt heat rise in her own face. She pressed his hand tighter and said nothing, because some things were better left to time and hope. Spring came early that year. The desert erupted in wildflowers, carpets of gold and purple spreading across the valley. Eliza's garden flourished, producing vegetables she traded in town for fabric and books. Caleb built the rooms he'd mentioned, 2 of them, working in the evenings with Isaac's help. Isaac had taken a job at the neighboring ranch, close enough to visit on Sundays. He was courting Nell Buchanan's niece, a quiet girl named Clara, who didn't mind his nightmares and made a peach pie that could make a grown man weep. Virgil Kane had gone surprisingly civil since the hearing. He tipped his hat when he saw Eliza in town, called her Mrs. Dunn with something approaching respect. Whether it was the town's solidarity or simply the realization that Eliza wasn't prey had changed his calculation, she didn't know and didn't care.
It was a morning in late April when Eliza knew for certain. She'd been suspicious for weeks, but the morning sickness confirmed it. She sat on the edge of the bed she now shared with Caleb and pressed her hands to her stomach and felt the world tilt. She told him that evening, stood in the kitchen where they'd shared 100 meals and 1,000 silences, and said, "I'm carrying your child." Caleb set down his coffee cup with a precision that suggested his hands would shake if he let them. "You're sure?" "Nell confirmed it this afternoon. She says late November." He stood slowly, walked around the table, stood in front of her, and put his hands on her shoulders, then moved them to her face, cupping her jaw the way he'd done the first time he'd kissed her, with that careful, deliberate tenderness that was purely and entirely Caleb. "A baby," he said. "A baby. Our baby." He pulled her against him and held her, and she felt his heart hammering through his shirt and his breath catching in his chest. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. "I'm scared," he said. "So am I. I don't know how to be a father. Mine was a monster. What if—" "You are not your father. You are the man who builds shelves for books and leaves peppermint on the tray and knocks before entering rooms. You are going to be a wonderful father, because you already know what a father should never be." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth. Then he knelt and pressed his lips to her stomach, and Eliza ran her fingers through his hair and looked out the window at the ranch they'd built together, and felt something she hadn't felt since she was a child before her mother died. Safe. Truly, completely, all the way down to her bones, safe. The baby came on a cold November night. Isaac rode for Doc Avery, while Caleb held Eliza's hand through contractions that felt like the earth splitting open. She cursed. She screamed. She gripped Caleb's fingers hard enough to grind the bones together. "I can't," she gasped. "You survived Douglas Mercer. You stood down Agnes Whitfield. You argued with Virgil Kane to his face. You can do anything." "I hate you." "I know. Push." She pushed, and when Doc Avery placed the squalling, furious, perfect infant in her arms, Eliza wept with a joy so enormous it felt like it might break her open. "A girl," Doc Avery said, smiling. "Healthy and loud. Good lungs on this one." Caleb looked at his daughter with an expression Eliza had never seen on his face before. Awe. Pure, unguarded, defenseless awe. "Hannah," Eliza said softly. "Hannah Rose Dunn." Caleb's eyes snapped to hers. "For the woman who loved you first," Eliza said. "And for the garden that taught me things can grow from anything, even grief." He couldn't speak. He pressed his forehead to Eliza's, and they stayed like that, breathing together, their daughter between them, while Brutus whined at the bedroom door and Isaac paced the porch and the desert wind carried the sound of new life across the valley. Ruth Avery came the next morning. She held baby Hannah and cried without apology, and told Eliza she was the bravest woman she'd ever known, second only to the Hannah who came before. "She would have loved this," Ruth said. "She would have loved you." "I know," Eliza said. "I read her journal. She had enough love for everyone." Months passed. Hannah grew fat and loud and demanding, with her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's stubbornness. She grabbed at everything,
pulled Brutus's ears, screamed at the chickens, fell asleep in Caleb's arms every evening while he read aloud from whatever book he'd borrowed from Nell. On a September evening, a year to the day since Eliza had fallen from the stagecoach onto Copper Bluff's main street, she stood in her garden with Hannah on her hip and watched Caleb work with the horses. He moved differently now, lighter. The grief was still there, would always be there, woven into him like thread in fabric. But it no longer bent him double. It no longer drove him to the barn at midnight to stare at a beam and hate himself. He looked up and caught her watching. Smiled. A real smile, not the ghost of one, but the full thing, rare and blinding. "What are you thinking?" he called. Eliza looked at her daughter, at her husband, at the house they'd filled with laughter and argument and the smell of good coffee, and the sound of a baby who didn't know yet how cruel the world could be, but who would learn, someday, that it could also be merciful. "I'm thinking about something Hannah wrote in her journal," Eliza called back. She asked if you could rebuild a person from broken pieces, or if you just create something new from the wreckage. "What's the answer?" Eliza kissed her daughter's head, felt the weight of Hannah's ring on her finger, thought of every blow she'd taken, every mile she'd traveled, every locked door and peppermint drop and quiet evening by the fire that had led her to this exact moment. "Both," she said. "The answer is both." Caleb walked toward her across the yard, this man who'd failed once and refused to fail again, who'd pulled a stranger from the dust and given her the two things she'd needed most: a door she could lock and a heart she could trust. He took Hannah from her arms. The baby grabbed his nose and shrieked with delight. Brutus circled their legs, tail going, and Eliza stood in the garden she'd coaxed from dead ground, in the life she'd built from nothing, and understood at last what she'd been trying to say in all those unmailed letters to her brothers. I survived. Not because I was strong enough, not because I was lucky enough, but because one man in a crowd of wolves chose to be decent. And from that single act of decency, everything else grew. They went inside as the stars came out. Caleb banked the fire. Eliza nursed Hannah by lamplight. And the house that had once held nothing but ghosts and silence held something else now. Something that no amount of violence or cruelty or time could destroy. Not happiness. Happiness was too small a word for it. Home. They were home. And home, Eliza knew, was not a place you found. It was a thing you built, board by board, bruise by bruise, choice by choice, until the wreckage became foundation, and the scars became stories, and the broken pieces fit together into something that could stand against any storm the world had left to throw. This was their story. Not a fairy tale. Not a dime novel romance with a pretty ending tied in ribbon. A true story, messy and painful and imperfect, about two people who'd been shattered by violence and rebuilt by stubborn, terrifying, inconvenient love. And it was enough. God help them both. It was more than enough.